Welcome back. This time I am with ROOHI Bali. She is co-founder of Score Limited, that is a company advocated to green solutions. I was interested in talking to her about discussing with her the issue of climate, because in a previous interview we have addressed how this issue is seen here in the United States, where much of the activism has been dedicated to reducing consumption in a very naive option that doesn't take into account the aspiration of emerging markets like Singapore, Southeast Asia, and above all, doesn't take into account new nasty realities like the imperial ambitions of Vladimir Putin, as we have seen. So if you ask Vladimir, if you tell Vladimir Putin that the Arctic is melting, he will not say, "Oh, the polar bears are dying." No, he will say, "Great, now we can offer China an option to get to Europe more cheaply." So there is that need of reframing the climate issue could benefit a lot from the input from Asia. Now, Ruki is from Singapore, and so she can offer us a perspective on about how the climate issue is being framed in Asia. And so please let us know where is the accent in Asia, in new technologies to at least gain time and prevent climate disaster, that which is an existential threat, or reducing consumption and cool options like here in the United States.
Okay, thank you, Alfredo, for this interesting opportunity. Well, the perspective which I'm sharing is I'm actually, since I'm not from the States, so I'm actually sharing my perspective from an outsider who is kind of staying in Asia at the moment. So I would be talking more on the sides of what Singapore is doing, what China is doing, for example, or what Malaysia is doing, what Indonesia is doing. So I would be kind of focusing on those areas. Well, talking about climate change, in my opinion, I think climate change is not to be dictated by one country, or it is not to be dictated by the country who is in power. This has to be a collective approach, and this needs to be taken care by all the countries in total. And I think some countries are shifting their focus on geopolitical issues, but with geopolitical issues also, you can still focus on climate actions policies. And I'll give you very good examples. For example, let's start with Singapore, what Singapore is doing. So Singapore is, as we all know, Singapore is a very small country, but they are doing a lot of R&D innovations when it comes to carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies. A very good example would be they have started forming a lot of collaborations from countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, where what they are doing are actually they are already setting up a transport and storage ecosystem between these countries. So when the technology is ready, and if there needs to be offshoring these technologies to countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore has already started working on the policies. So if I have to look into the perspective from US or from other countries, so I would say this is actually a very good opportunity which US as a huge country can cater on. They can be the leader in these kind of initiatives, and they can actually start integrating their nearby partner countries. A very good examples would be Mexico, Canada. So they can actually have similar cross border carbon storage collaborations with these countries, and then they can expand their reach to international countries. So, this would be a very good one example on Singapore. Next, my second pointer would be on the policy integration. So, when I talk about policy integration, I am actually referring to the point how climate action policies can be integrated into national and security goals. So, when we are talking about development of a country, how we can integrate these policies very easily into our existing policies. So, I'll give you a very good example on Singapore being the leader, already leading in these policy making initiatives. But the another examples would come from China, for example. So, what China is doing actually, so China is working on a public private model partnerships where they are setting up 5 years frameworks. So, when I say 5 year frameworks, which means they are working towards developing strategies on climate actions and also integrating it on their energy security frameworks. Because these are all the developing countries, so that's how they are working on their policies. Another example, which I would love to quote, would be from India. So, what India is doing, so India has started incentivizing these R&D technologies, and so they're providing you 100% incentives. So any company who is working towards carbon storage technologies, so the government is incentivizing them on different areas. And also India is opening discussions with another countries to have cross border partnerships on these areas as well.
Now, when it comes to when we talk about policies, we
Mhm.
talk about not about lowering consumption, but basically sharing technology, right? And when it comes to sharing technology, is where we have to. So we have. I don't know if you call it international activism or however you want to call it. Should put an accent that the focus should not be in lowering consumption, because it's going to be very hard to sell Indonesia, for instance, to abstain from exploiting nickel. Uh, that's very easy from in a country like the United States, but not in a developing country like Indonesia. But in sharing these technologies, because to set the climate agenda aside from other geopolitical considerations, because you need to develop, for instance, to develop also technology not only in carbon capture, but
Yeah.
also in storage from
Yeah.
renewables to make them more even more viable. And you have to, but you cannot subject those technologies to patents and other issues, but you have to share it. Otherwise, it's very of very little use. Another point is, how do you implement it? You were mentioning in our pre-interview that in at least Singapore in next year is going to put more accent on the power of regulation of the states.
Yeah.
And the problem I see in the United States is that they are still trying to use incentives,
Yeah.
which could be. Uh, I would have been open to incentives in the 1990s, but not right now. You need to have more forceful actions. And I was mentioning in our pre-interview the case of carbon capture precisely here in the United States, where it has been discredited, not because of the technology, but because of the way it has been implemented, like tax credits. And at
Yeah.
the end, in the end, companies ended up increasing their pollution and using carbon capture to capture the extra carbon they were emitting, and in the end, the net benefit was zero. But it was not zero because there was something wrong with carbon capture, but because of the ridiculous way in which you have implemented the policy. So it's what is your take about this?
Actually, that's a very good point because at the moment, if you look on different countries and how their reporting policies are set or disclosure policies are set, so there is not a uniform standard. And this is where a lot of confusion is sitting. So, for example, when we talk about carbon markets or we are talking about the reporting, so one important aspect, which is transparency, it is still missing. So many countries are following volunteer disclosures, and other countries are, example would be starting 2026, Singapore is transitioning towards compulsory disclosures when it comes to carbon markets, when it comes to reportings, financial reportings, carbon accountings. So Singapore is heading towards compulsory disclosure. So I think talking about the policies, I think this is the kind of the governance which is missing in most of the countries' policies, including the states. So this needs to be done from the governance level, and this need to be done on a very strict basis, that the shift needs to happen from volunteer disclosures to mandatory disclosures. So this is something where US can actually, they can actually uh, lead the discussions on carbon pricing integrations and how they are kind of trace those integrations and how the reportings are done. So there is still a lot of mismatch, and that is where I think US can get as inspired from countries like Singapore
Oh,
or Australia, for example. So they are the one who are shifting towards mandatory disclosures.
now let's be honest. That's not going to happen during the Trump administration. Anything on that of that sort is going to it will have to be planned to start in 2029, assuming that a more reasonable government comes to power. But for that to happen and not be pushed aside by other priorities, it will depend on how you sell the issue. And you have to, after years in which naive activism on the left has portrayed the issue of climate change as a matter of reducing consumption, you would have now to reframe the issue in order to sell, because what you need is an increase in the power of government to impose new standards. For that to happen, you have to reframe the issue of climate change, so that first, to people can understand that it's an existential threat, and second, be more amenable to the expansion of government power. And third, the investment in technologies, something that also has been curtailed by this government.
So, again, I would say, Alfredo, this is a very valid point because when we are talking of integrating such technologies or such policies on a wide level, so these policies and technologies need to be supported by fundings, investors' interest. Also, in my personal opinion, I feel there is a lot of between uh, gap on the education side. And when I meant by education, I meant by that the individuals and the companies doing pollutions, they have no clue what is happening on the education side, especially the common man. They are kind of, very blank when it comes to understanding carbon emissions. They have zero understandings on carbon reportings. So that is where a huge gap is sitting. So one initiative which can be done very easily is start educating common people, because when the pressure would start building up uh, from the bottom to top approach, then definitely there would be some policy changes as well.
but
Also,
but
definitely.
That
Yeah, go
let's
on,
be on,
please.
let's be honest. So is you are not going to be once we have established the need for expansion of government regulation and investment in new technologies. The fact of the matter is that you are not going to sell this as a matter of hard data in science, because that people don't understand that. So the common man, the best way to sell the climate issue is to present them with the opportunities, for instance, job opportunities in winterization and other aspects. So they look, the state that benefits the most from the renewables is one of the most reddest Republican states in the union, which is Texas,
Mm.
which is right now fighting the government because the government wants to cut benefits for the renewables that are flourishing and creating jobs in Texas. The other point is how do you present the existential threat? You have to present the existential threat in terms of people who are like them, because of otherwise people are unfortunately not very prone to empathize with what happens in the Maldives, for instance. But they may feel more empathy with what happens to people in the coast of Florida or
Mm.
the Midwest. So that's the way you sell it, because well, I don't know if how this issue has been solved in Singapore, so people are more amenable to more regulation instead of less.
Okay. Since you asked very categorically for Singapore, so Singapore, their governance style is very different. For some regulations, when they want to um, include a policy on a serious level, then they have also aligned the policy with different punitive structures. So, very good examples would be, and this is where I'm referring to when a transitioning is happening from voluntary disclosures to compulsory disclosures in 2026. So, which means companies, including the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises segments, so if they are not adapting to the new policies, then there is a lot of punishments on the fees and fines are set in place by the government, which will force a company or SMEs to start slowly transitioning towards mandatory
Yeah,
disclosures.
yeah, just to make it clarify the issue, SMEs are small, medium enterprises, small
That's
businesses.
correct. That's correct. So
And
in
my question is, how has Singapore solved the issue? So the public, different from here, the United States, where you have found a backlash against climate. So in Singapore, is the public opinion has been more friendly to this expansion of power?
Yes, that's correct. So, what Singapore has done as a country, they are open for the suggestions, they are open for the partnerships, they are open for cross border arrangements, they are open to change their policies. So, what is happening is like when they were in the process of shifting to mandatory disclosures. So they had a proper groups meetings organized within the ecosystem. So when I talk about ecosystem, there are different stakeholders in the ecosystem. So stakeholders would be the companies who are working on carbon technologies. Same time, these stakeholders would be companies polluting and contributing towards the carbon emissions. Another stakeholders would be government, airlines, airports, common man. So when they included, they formed a committee, and then they took inputs from everyone. So those inputs were very useful in formulation of a proper policy. That is where I think those there are a lot of gaps when we talk about climate policies, because most of the countries they fail to understand this thing, that this is not a job of single government, single department. This is a job of a collective approach. So, which means someone who is working in the policy side, they need to sit and work with industries, they need to sit and work with common man, they need to sit with the educational institutions. That is how the change needs to happen. That is how the policy
But
planning needs to be integrated.
but let me understand something. Is there in Singapore political forces lobbying against these changes in climate regulation, or is there a consensus about the need of these policies?
I would say there is more consensus towards the positive aspect of the policy. So this is where countries are open for the collaborations. Good example to quote again would be Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. They have already entered into an agreement with Singapore government, agreeing on the um, transfer of technologies, sharing of technologies, storage solutions, transporting those new technologies to their countries. So they have already closed an agreement on that area. So, which means these countries are way ahead in implementing and acting on new technologies.
Singapore is in Southeast Asia a special case because it's the country that benefits the most from the West investment. But
Yeah.
in the rest of South Asia, China is in economic terms is more has more influence. And how is China? So my question is, how is China going along with these new standards?
Well, China is aggressive on their side, but of course they function very differently. So with China they are more focusing on the public private partnerships within the country. So they are not expanding outside the countries at the moment, but they are working along the lines within their country. So that is where I think they are acting little different when as compared to Singapore.
So you could say that we have three cases: the United States, where this issue is in the middle of the clashes between Republicans and Democrats, which means that there is no consensus. The case of Southeast Asia, where there is a movement to common standards, and China, that has its own standards on climate, but it's making progress. So
Yes.
so what we need is a movement to unify these three blocks in common policies.
Yeah, we need, I would say, we need a systematic shift actually. And when I talk about systematic shift, then I will highlight five important areas which can be included in the shift. So that would be regional collaborations, international collaborations, policy and security integrations, R&D fundings and incentives, carbon markets and reporting, then innovation ecosystems because they can encourage small young new companies as well, and then policy consistency. So if we integrate all these into one approach, that becomes a systematic shift. And that is what I think US being the biggest country and biggest contributor to so many factors can actually lead this change and set a very good example.
I agree. The problem is that the United States, you cannot rely on the United States to lead on this issue. The United States will have to be dragged on this issue, and is I believe the way Southeast Asia and China get to a consensus So they can form a significant bloc on this issue, what can drag the United States. But expecting that the United States is going to lead that when they are defunding the research in carbon capture and fusion on MIT is too it could be as naive as expecting that climate is going to make progress by reducing consumption. So that means that what brings us to how much is Asia? If I would have to ask you, outside Singapore, what country is leading the climate effort? Is it China or is it any other country in Southeast Asia?
Well, in that case, then I would name more than one country because China is definitely leading in lots of areas, be it hydrogen, be it carbon capture, be it on electric side, they're doing it. The another example to quote would be India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam is also getting ready now. So Vietnam has recently they are working on their policy where they have agreed to come out on a phase wise basis to implement carbon policies into their national policies, and they are taking the references from countries like Singapore
But
to
from what
work.
you are saying, they are not already a block on this issue. They are converging, but
They are
not
they
already
are
a block.
Vietnam, yes, they are still work in progress, I would say, but they have already kind of started thinking on this direction.
Hmm. And one point you haven't mentioned is nuclear. One
Yeah.
problem with the United States is that many policies during the Biden administration were based on the false premise that you could force the transition to renewables by punishing fossil fuels. And the matter is that that didn't work. So instead of accelerating the transition, they only created a backlash that in the way the Biden administration have been translated in the removal of all the incentives the Inflation Reduction Act had for renewable projects. So the problem is the transition. And in the transition, the cleanest option it seems to be nuclear, and if possible, investment in research and development for fusion that is a more efficient way of managing nuclear. And my question is, how is Asia in terms of nuclear energy? Is that an important part of the transition or not?
Yes. They are already considering on the sides of nuclear energies also and renewable energies, because they are like some countries are already using renewable energy examples, be it sunlight, water. Um, so they are working on these areas. But now the new area of interest is definitely nuclear energy. I would say countries are not ready yet, but they have already started thinking in that direction. And uh, again, what they are doing is they are clearly utilizing the same reference points like carbon technologies or carbon storage technologies. Because when we talk about nuclear technologies, it's not a single country's responsibility. So they are actually looking with the international collaborations. A very good examples to quote would be Singapore is working very closely with, for example, European governments, okay, where they are actually kind of working on these areas where they can kind of work on the nuclear technologies. The another country which is following the footsteps of Singapore is India. So India is definitely working very closely with European countries to come and manufacture these technologies, maybe as a joint initiative, and use a standard policy, but they are, I would say, they are work in progress. They are not there yet, but they have started working on these areas.
Now that you mention Europe, the case of Germany is very telling. During the Merkel era, they closed the three nuclear plants, and now the Green parties has fiercely opposed reopening those plants.
Mm-hmm.
Not even Merz, Frederick Merz, have been able to reopen them.
Mm-hmm.
So once you close, and it's very difficult to in Europe in general, it's pretty much it's France. Other countries are very hostile to nuclear energy.
Yes.
What brings me to the case of Asia. Do you see this this kind of political hostility in Singaporean parties towards nuclear energy as we found among the Greens in Europe?
I would say there is little bit of uncertainties because again those uncertainties on the are on the sides of, because people are still not very clear what they are doing. And you rightly mentioned, any, see, nuclear technologies, when we talk about nuclear technologies, they are technically, which means something which is already existing. Now you need to do a shift, major shift on those technologies to new technologies. So which means when you are transitioning from existing technologies to new technologies, there are always lot of bottlenecks and challenges involved. So that transition, that is where the education is still missing, and that is where a lot of methodologies are missing, that how those integrations can be done using, thinking about environment. Very
But
good example to quote. Sorry,
But
go on.
at least you don't find any political party inside Singapore or Asia in Asia in general with that is hostile to nuclear because. For instance, again, in the case of Germany, the problem was that once the cheap gas coming from Russia came to an end, they had, and because the Greens still devoid of reality, they kept refusing reopening these three plants. Germany ended up returning to coal.
Hmm.
So you don't have in Asia this hostility to
I
nuclear.
would say, with my limited knowledge, I have not seen any such hostile discussions happening on around these topics. What I have understood is countries are willing to find a solution, and they are actually working to find a common, uniform, standard solution, even if for that, even if they have to change their own policies, or they have to go and form a partnership with other country, they are kind of exploring these options. So they are open for these kind of changes,
Which one would
adaptations.
which one would you say are the countries that are more behind? For probably Indonesia, or in terms of climate.
Behind in terms of climate, or in terms of,
Of this Asian consensus toward the need of having this transition as soon as possible to renewables.
to renewables. Okay. um Good examples would be, um, I would say, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia. These are still behind when it comes to utilizing renewable energies, because Indonesia is focusing on their,
That this reluctance is based on what? In access to technology or are some other factor?
I would say the factors are, it's a combination of mixed factors. So, of course, related on the government level and also on the individual level. So, on the government level, the countries are still developing. They don't have those kind of resources which West can offer. right? So they are dependent on lot of financial fundings and all, which is actually kind of coming from countries like Singapore, China. China is investing very heavily in technologies into Vietnam, in Cambodia. So that is where they are dependent on. So they are, as government, they are facing challenges. And also on the individual level, I think they are not still ready to do a
So,
major shift.
so you would say it's not hostility to renewables, but just access to technology plus the capital to invest in these new technologies.
Yes, I would say it's more on the sides of access to capital and governance. That is where I think they need help at the moment.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah.
at least there is not as hostility. Like, for instance, here in the United States, in some red states, where they are against renewables just because they are renewables.
Mm.
They
No,
have been
but
considered woke and cool and many other because, in part, because of the terrible way these technologies have been sold. But now, let me give you the last 3 minutes to give you the last word, so you can bring visibility on anything you believe it's necessary.
okay, well, again, I would say if you will ask my 5 pointers, so my 5 pointers will be we need to start focusing on inclusive transitions. When I say inclusive transitions, which means that okay, if a country is missing on the fundings opportunities, then the another country should step up and offer those funding opportunities, discuss the technology part and all. That is where I think inclusive transition is very important. We need to start industry is talking on decarbonizations and net zero, whereas I think my personal opinion would be we need to start talking on nature positive outcomes. So anything if we are utilizing from nature and if the after effects is positive, that is a good decision. But if it is not positive, then I think we need to rethink our thoughts on that. Third pointer would be climate change is in nobody's control. So the countries need to start preparing themselves for climate resilience and adaptation according to that. Most of the countries are facing flood, tsunami, storm situations. How those countries are mitigating those risks, that is where I think the resilience and adaptation is required. Next pointer would be, of course, there is lot of carbon emission happening. So we need to start thinking on how we can think of possible solutions to remove high value carbons. By no matter you can incentivize it, you can add it to tax benefits, you can link it to full disclosures, transparencies, reporting, but it has to done on a collective level. And
And
my last pointer would be there need to be an integrated climate social goals. So when I say integrated means the countries need to come forward, they need to form a unified approach to work on this problem.
well, that's all the time I have right now. But I want to thank you. It has been very enlightening. Hopefully, please let me know if there is any news that could be worth mentioning in a future possible next conversation. And thank you again.
Sure, sure. Thank you. And lovely interacting with you.